I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the show, we'll be hearing from Geoffrey Aronson, a longtime commentator and analyst of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and more broadly, issues pertaining to the Middle East. He's returning to the show. He usually comes on at least once a year now. I really respect his work. And we're going to be talking about an article he wrote for the American Conservative entitled The Unexpected Consequences of Dispelling Israeli Nuclear Ambiguity. You see, last month, Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, Democrat, led an initiative that's being supported by a number of House Democrats for Washington to openly discuss Israel's nuclear doctrine and capabilities. What does this mean, and what are the unintended consequences of it? Find out in the conversation to follow. This is a bigger story than most people realize, so give this a listen. Before we get to the conversation, though, I need to remind you that this show is listener funded. This week I'm releasing 3 episodes all on the same day. I do a lot of work to keep this show informative, thoughtful, and engaging for you, the listener. So if you can, please support me on patreon.com/parallaxviews. This is my full-time job, so I could use that support. Patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, check out the work of my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. You can sign up for the newsletter. Mike has a great trading and financial newsletter. It's free. Check it out. I've had listeners make a return on investment on Mike's trading tips. It's really worthwhile. One more time, that's wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to it with Geoffrey Aronson. Welcome back to Parallax Views. One of my favorite guests, Geoffrey Aronson, is an American writer, analyst, and consultant specializing in Middle East affairs. He's written for publications ranging from Responsible Statecraft to the American Conservative. He's participated in track 2 diplomatic efforts between Israel and Palestinian groups, and I find his analysis is often quite on point, and even more so, hits on areas that may not be as discussed at times. And I was really interested in speaking with him about this article, The Unexpected Consequences of Dispelling Israeli Nuclear Ambiguity. How are you doing, Geoffrey?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Do you want to talk about what spurred this article about Israel and its nuclear ambiguity? Ambiguity on, because I was unaware of this initiative led by Representative Castro of Texas.
Right. That was the news that prompted my article, and the news was that a number of members of Congress, all Democrats, if I recall correctly, were sort of demanding that Israel come clean about publicly announcing that it has nuclear weapons. And this is part of an overall effort, I assume, on the part of Democrats in the House to get more transparency generally throughout the region, including Iran, for example, whose nuclear capabilities have been the subject of some debate, as we can see. But the Israel piece of that is new and potentially quite important to American sort of strategic doctrine and how Israel translates its nuclear capabilities into policy.
So can we talk about Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity? Because it's not just a rhetorical convention. I think you would argue that it's been a hidden foundation of the post-1967 U.S.-Israel defense order.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. You know, the Americans, for example, have a nuclear doctrine, which is in a way quite specific, in other respects ambiguous. But for example, the Americans don't agree to commit themselves to no first use, unlike, I think, China and certainly Russia. So, for example, so in Israel's case, since the 1950s, when Israel began its work to develop a nuclear weapon, first in league with the French, it has had to adopt a doctrine explaining its capabilities and explaining under what circumstances it will deploy, use, implement some element of its nuclear capabilities. So over time, this is a very long story to make it real short, the Americans and Israel made an arrangement in the late 1960s. And the arrangement was as follows. The United States would commit to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge in the region against any combination of enemies, in return for which Israel would keep its nuclear capabilities unmentioned, undeclared, and what we call in the basement. And as compensation for that, or as part of that bargain, the Americans would assure that Israel had the conventional arsenal deep enough and extensive enough to enable it to implement a very aggressive foreign policy throughout the region.
And this actually involved, I guess this arrangement goes back to what, Paul Warnke and also Yitzhak Rabin.
Right. They were the principals during the Nixon administration who formalized the deal and who started the pipeline of advanced American military equipment that has continued to this day. People may not remember or recall that in the 50s and 60s, the Americans weren't sending guns to Israel at all. And it was primarily the French who were supporting Israel. Only after the June 67 war did a real defense relationship between the US and Israel come into being and expand. And it's expanded to this day. The Obama administration, for example, made an arrangement over time to supply Israel with X billion dollars of weapons. So it's been a bipartisan campaign throughout and enjoyed wall-to-wall popularity on Capitol Hill. And what this effort by members of Congress suggests is that bargain is fraying for all sorts of reasons. And you can't necessarily fix one piece of a puzzle without it affecting other pieces of that picture in some respects in ways that you may not have considered. So, for example, I'll give you one example. Israel and Egypt both arranged with the United States during the Ford administration and the Carter administration as part of, no, it wasn't Ford. I'm sorry, it was Carter, Camp David. It was Carter. During the Camp David talks in the late 70s, early 80s, when Israel and Egypt made a treaty of peace between them, part of that was an American commitment to supply each of those parties with X billion dollars a year in military aid. And that ratio has changed a bit over time. Israel certainly gets more than Egypt, but each party over the last 30 years, 40 years, could depend on a reliable American defense supply relationship. Now, that, of course, was also built not only on the issue of peace between Egypt and Israel, it was also built on the premise of a continuing American commitment to Israel's qualitative military edge, QME. i.e., keeping its bombs in the basement, its nukes in the basement, in return for a reliable supply of conventional armaments. Now, if you change a piece of that, you, in a sense, call into question the American defense supply relationship with Egypt, which, of course, is undergoing its own strains independent of this issue. But you can't change the American attitude towards Israel's nuclear doctrine without calling into question the need to revitalize or reform or tamper with the American defense supply relationship with Egypt, which for many generations, not generations, for many decades, has been a strategic anchor of the U.S. in the region. Now, that is also changing. This is a dynamic interaction here, but it's not at all clear that members of Congress really understood the implications, the broader implications of simply calling for greater transparency in Israel's nuclear doctrine.
Can you talk a little bit? I just want to backtrack a little bit into. It's always been odd to me. I remember when we were talking about nuclear weapons in one of my high school classes that I took. We had to know all the countries that had nukes, and the teacher said, "And there's one other country, Israel, but we know they have nukes, but we don't say they have nukes." And I asked the question, I'm like, why? And he didn't really know how to answer that. It's interesting because it's strategic, but for people that may not know, how does the U.S. benefit from this arrangement, at least in the past, and how do the Israelis benefit from it?
Well, the Americans benefit over time. The received wisdom has been that the American-Israeli relationship generally, and the defense relationship in particular, is a net positive for U.S. influence and the U.S. role in the region. Okay? We can debate that, but within the government itself, whether it be Democratic or Republican administrations, the conclusion has been that the net result is in our interests.
This is like the national security state consensus.
Yeah, and politically as well. Certainly, members of Congress have been vital over the years in assuring American foreign aid generally. And the commitment to supply aid to Israel has been one of the central pillars from establishing a majority in Congress to support more generally foreign aid. So one piece of the conventional wisdom has been that without the support of the pro-Israel bloc in Congress for foreign aid to Israel, no one else would be able to hitch a ride on that it would be very hard to gain a majority in Congress to support foreign aid generally. So this has been across the board, a matter of consensus by and large. Now, you can argue with that, and people have, but historically that hasn't had any traction. But this element that has been recently introduced, along with other indications that Americans generally, members of Congress as a consequence, are in a sense beginning to rethink the parameters of U.S. support for Israel, may create a picture that is unlike the picture that we've been used to seeing since the late 1960s.
Has it been a way that does the arrangement also historically allow the U.S. to avoid confronting its contradictions when it comes to its non-proliferation policy?
Well, sure. Yeah, absolutely. You make reference to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which essentially prohibits non-nuclear weapon state from crossing that threshold and maintains the nuclear franchise only for a few countries who are recognized nuclear weapon states. Israel is not one of those, and it saves itself, and it's saved the Americans historically a lot of grief by deflecting calls for a more declaratory policy of Israeli nukes by simply saying we won't be the first ones to introduce nuclear weapons into the region. That also has been a
Doesn't that ties into the Perez formula, right?
that I was going to mention. Yes,
Okay.
that was mentioned by that was declared by Shimon Peres many years ago. He was foreign minister, I believe, at the time. But again, this was an off-the-cuff remark of his that was not the consequence of great internal discussion amongst Israel's strategic elite as to how to address this. But his off-the-cuff remark saying that Israel won't be the first to introduce has, over the years, become one of the foundational doctrines guiding Israeli policy, primarily in international fora like the ones you suggested with the NPT, enabling it to essentially deflect international attention to Israel's nuclear capabilities. And again, it hasn't been without controversy over the years. During the 70s, there was discussion, or in 80s, of Israeli collaboration with South Africa. There was even a question of whether or not a nuclear bomb was exploded in the Indian Ocean by Israel and South Africa. Again, by saying we aren't going to be the first to introduce these, we have no declared nuclear doctrine in terms of first use or whatever. So it enabled Israel and the U.S. as its sort of international protector to escape the scrutiny of the international community, if you will.
I know this is a side note, but one of the most dramatic sections in your article is about the 1973 October War and
Right.
Moshe Dayan. Can you talk about why you included references to that in the article and what that section of the article is meant to really elucidate?
Well, what I wrote was a sort of a recounting of the story which most informed sources consider to be accurate, which was as follows. During the early days of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel had been caught flat-footed, and there was a historic Egyptian advance in Sinai, but there was also an accompanying Syrian advance on the Golan Heights to a degree that it was seen to be threatening to the Israeli heartland itself, that Syrian tanks would race down from the Golan Heights and enter Israel proper, the heartland of Israel, near the Sea of Galilee and surrounding towns. This was seen by Israeli officials, including the Minister of Defense Dayan, as a dire situation, which at one point he reportedly said the Third Temple is in danger, i.e. the state of Israel is in danger. So this would call for extraordinary responses. So what is speculated about and hasn't been demonstrated conclusively is that Israel ordered the preparation of its nuclear land-based systems in order to deter a Syrian advance, i.e. probably to put pressure on Moscow to rein in the Assad regime in 1973. So this was seen as a demonstration of how dangerous wars in the Middle East could be, and also the fact that Israel was very close to declaring openly its nuclear capacity.
Do you think it's also important in the sense that it illustrates that there is, I guess, there's always been a sense in Israel in certain corners that there's existential stakes, like, and if we have to use a nuke, we'll use it.
Well, apparently, this was the thought process that was dominating Diane's mind in the first days of the war. I should add that this assessment changed in the day or two, so that in that sense, the nuclear crisis passed. But there have been other, excuse me, there have been other instances, primarily, for example, during the first Gulf War, when there was concern that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons that they were going to use against Israel. There was a dance between Israel, the U.S., and Iraq at that time during the war. Questions about under what circumstances would Israel feel compelled to respond to a non-conventional attack by Saddam Hussein, which never materialized, fortunately. But nonetheless, the consideration of Israel's nuclear capabilities was on the table and had to be addressed by responsible elements of our own national security state. So again, just highlighting that this is a metamorphosizing issue depending on circumstances. And we've seen in these last years, in terms of Israel's relationship with Iran, how important and how central a factor Iran's presumed or imagined nuclear capacity is. And we only have to do today is to turn on the TV to see this issue as front and center.
I wanted to ask you as well. So basically, what you're saying is congressional Democrats are now questioning the assumptions that were previously untouchable with regards to this strategy of Israeli nuclear ambiguity and the U.S. Israel sort of talking points on that.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about the way in which Trump and Netanyahu may have actually helped accelerate political blowback in Washington rather than strengthening deterrence against Iran?
Okay, well, anytime you fashion a foreign policy matrix and you include in that the nuclear capacity of one or all of the players and circumstances under which these capabilities would be monitored, constrained, assessed, you necessarily bring front and center the issue more broadly. Once you open that box, you don't know where the genie is going to appear. So I'm not at all sure that members of Congress understood the ramifications of their interest in shedding a light for the first time, in a sense, on Israel's nuclear doctrine. I really tend to doubt that the kind of conversation you and I are having about this is one that they themselves had.
So even Congress, these congressional Democrats, they may be opening up something that they don't even realize as well.
I would presume so, yeah. Yeah, because again, it's fairly esoteric. It's because it hasn't been, because of the success of the policy about this with the US and Israel, there hasn't been a great deal of intellectual or political time spent in the US thinking about this outside a circle of, very small numbers of people. So it's entirely possible that members of Congress said, yeah, we don't like what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. We're concerned about the fact that Netanyahu is leading Trump down these dead ends. We need to rethink more broadly the U.S. support for Israel. And what better place to start than this sort of secretive doctrine that Israel has kept, in the closet for so many decades.
Now, the other part of that question was, do you think there were any miscalculations by Trump and Netanyahu that have actually led us further in this direction where this whole issue is becoming more out in the open in ways that we wouldn't have expected even like 5 years ago.
Everything they've done has been wrong. Let's put it that way. Everything they've done has been wrong. I wrote a piece about a month or two ago
I was going to
calling,
ask you about this piece, the Strait of Hormuz.
asking, is this America's Suez moment? Now, nobody knows what I'm talking about when we say Suez moment. Here's a brief history. In 1956, Israel, France, and Great Britain invaded Nasser's Egypt in the fall of 1955 in order to reestablish British French control of the Suez Canal, and for Israel in order to topple an Arab leader that they didn't like. Now, instead of succeeding in this effort, they failed absolutely. And who was it who was the agent of their failure? Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said to the French and the Brits primarily, your moment in the Middle East has passed. We're the guys in the driver's seat now. You did this without telling us. We don't agree with this. Israel, you're going to have to withdraw your troops from Egypt and Sinai. England and France, you're going to have to step down and retreat from Egypt. Okay, so everything that the Egyptians and Israel at the time, everything that the British and the Israelis thought at the time would result from this was turned absolutely on its head. Instead of reaffirming British power, it undermined it totally in that part of the world. Instead of Israel stabilizing its rule with Egypt, it opened up a can of worms that exploded in June 1967. So my observation about this current adventure with the Iranians is everything that the United States and Israel assumed would occur as a consequence of their action has been called into question. And in contradiction to everything they hoped would occur, a whole host of related issues have actually come to dominate our consideration of this in a way that minimizes American and Israeli power in the region, and perhaps irreparably so, in a way that they won't be able to recover from. And I think that's what we're seeing, is an absolute fiasco in terms of consolidating American and Israeli military and strategic doctrine in that part of the world. And it's an ongoing crisis that's not getting any better.
Well, that leads to the question of, but why are these mistakes being made? What are the players missing? And as part of it, just the not understanding that even, maybe victories, you can have those, but that doesn't necessarily equal success in the geopolitical arena.
Well, look, according to their lights, they'll make an argument that they're winning, that we've obliterated, for example, Iran's nuclear capacity. Now, they may have to lie in order to get their point across, but that's not unusual itself. And they may be fooling themselves more than they're fooling anybody else. But again, we don't have a monopoly on that attitude either. So there are a lot of people, most of whom aren't too stupid, devoting a lot of time to reconciling the hoped-for aspirations that undergirded this policy and accommodating the real-world consequences of what we're doing. So, they can try their best to say black is white, the emperor has clothes, and we did it the right way, and we'll do it again if we have to. And if this much hasn't worked as well as we hope, we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it more until Iranian culture is destroyed, or or Iranian missile capabilities is somehow going to be returned to the Stone Age, or somehow we're going to uninvent capabilities that countries have amassed over the decades. So there's an unending store of rationales that can be used and that are being used in order to try to diffuse the consequences in the real world. But ultimately, the facts speak for themselves, and those who best understand the dynamic environment in which they operate are best positioned to profit from it. And one of the great concerns here is that both Israel and the US don't have a handle on what exactly is going on as a consequence of decisions that they've made. They're not prepared to face those consequences. And so what we're witnessing is a long, drawn out process, very dangerous, in which people are being forced to accommodate to facts on the ground. And that's where the Suez moment comes in, where your aspirations butt up against the real world consequences of your actions. And you have to accommodate them somehow. Because if you don't accommodate them, you lose even more. And we can make that argument too about this.
You mentioned earlier QME a lot. How important is understanding that aspect of this article for you and for my listeners? Why is that such an important concept? And is it sort of a hidden centerpiece to U.S. regional policy?
Every time that there's a change in administration in the US and Israel, every time that there's a new minister of defense in the US or Israel, there's always been an obligatory reference to American support for Israel's qualitative military edge, QME. That's the rubric, that's the policy rubric under which US arms sales to Israel are based. QME means the US, this goes back to the deal that was made in the 60s. QMA means that the United States will remain committed to implementing an arms supply policy with Israel that, on the one hand, maintains its conventional superiority against any combination of enemies, Arab and or Iranian, on the one hand, and number two, will enable Israel, give Israel the confidence it needs in order to freeze its nuclear capacities. Now, in fact, those capacities haven't been frozen. Israel, over the years, has, again, nobody knows exactly, but the informed community suggests that Israel has between 100 and 200 nuclear weapons. Now, these are part of what we call a triad, that they can be mounted on naval submarine assets, land-based assets, and can be delivered by air as well. So unlike the US and China and Russia and France and the US and England, Israel is also a member of that rarefied group that not only has nukes, but has various means to drop them. And so that's sort of the QME sort of universe that we've built over the decades.
Before closing out, just two more things here. This is sort of a two-parter. So the first part is, what are the potential, I'm not saying definitive, but potential consequences of this initiative by Democratic Congress people? Because I want to put that out there. What does it mean that nuclear ambiguity is being put into question when it comes to Israel?
Well, it marks a change. It marks, in some respects, a dramatic change in the status quo in terms of Israel's publicly addressed nuclear doctrine, and also, to some extent, its deployment on the ground, which is a function in large part of what the doctrine is. So by opening this up, you really don't know where it's going to land. Is the American effort in Congress just a one-off letting off steam? Because Israel is engaged in doing things that many members of Congress these days might oppose. So is this just a matter of pique on the part of these members of Congress who just want to, in a sense, punish Israel generally because of its policies in Gaza and so forth? Is this, on the other hand, a well thought out policy that aims at constraining Israel's nuclear posture? It aims at endangering QME. Is this something that the Israeli strategic and security elite needs to plan around and take a worst case view and say the American defense support for Israel is now eroding to such a degree as to force us to recalibrate our own policies? Is this a new world in which we need to operate, and in which the sort of the nuclear bedrock has come unstuck? And not only are we now focusing on Iran, but now you're focusing on our crown jewels as well. And therefore, we have to somehow compensate for this brave new world that these people have maybe unintentionally created for us.
In other words, you're saying that this opens up questions that may have been considered fringe, 5, 10 years ago.
Or settled in a sense, it's
Right.
it's not a problem. Let's leave it alone.
And then
So it's a problem now.
the last thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you think the long-term consequences are potentially for this Iran war? And I don't know if we can tie Gaza into that, but just what do you think the long-term potential impacts are for Gaza and the Iran war?
It's a fiasco, and it's hard to make lemonade out of lemons. It's very hard to make lemonade out of lemons. In this case, we're hoping to get back to a place we were before the war started, and apparently that would be considered a victory, right? If the Straits of Hormuz are opened and we re-engage with Iran on its nuclear program in a way in which is supported by the UN and so forth. I think today people are thinking that would be a great outcome. That would be victory. Okay, but again, you're fooling yourself here, because you can't just undo damage that's been done and weaknesses that have been exposed. And I think an article in The Economist, in some respects, said it best when they're talking about China and this issue. And The Economist opine, say, don't get in the way of someone who's making an error, right? Just sit there and watch them dig a hole for themselves, a strategic hole, a policy hole, a political hole for themselves. That's what the Americans and Israel are now engaged in doing. We're digging a really big hole for ourselves. And those people who want to profit from our shortcomings are taking our measure and will seek in many ways to undermine not only the policies we're pursuing toward Iran, but more generally the policies that undergird the American role in that part of the world and beyond. So you can't. We're not playing chess here with ourselves, as it all too often appears to be the case in Washington today. there are people who are gaming this out as if our opponents have no options, as if all we have to do is move from A to B and we've accomplished something, not thinking that they can move from B to A or B to C. So it's a laziness and inadequacy in the policy making system here that others are only too happy to take our advantage or our advantage of. And my great fear is we're only at the beginning of this, that our system isn't learning from its own shortcomings here and does not even know how to conduct.
It's almost like you're describing a system that is solipsistic.
Yeah, well, I wrote a piece saying this a couple of months ago, that the Trump people don't know how to make policy. They don't know how to fashion a bureaucracy with international responsibilities in a way in which will lead to the promotion of our interest. It's Trump's foreign policy is two guys in a room, free associating. Sometimes only one guy in a room free associating. And that's a very dangerous position to be in, not only for the objects of that policy, but also for the authors of that policy. And that's where we are today.
I guess the last line in your article on the Suez moment, whether this is a Suez moment, sums it up quite well, and maybe you can just unpack it briefly here. You say, but Iran today, like Egypt of the free officers, or Nasser's Egypt, finds itself as the unintended centerpiece of a post-American order that Washington neither desired nor intended.
Yeah, again, we're not playing chess here with ourselves. And rather than to demonstrate the agility and the success of American policy and American policy makers, what we've done is, in a sense, the opposite. We've shown a light on our shortcomings and our failures to marry our capabilities with preferred policy options. Instead, we're being jacked around. And the emperor has no clothes here. While everybody here insists the emperor is fully outfitted, he's beautiful. He can do whatever he wants. He can bomb Iran into the Stone Age. He can obliterate their policy of nuclear development. He's fully clothed. But the Chinese know that he's not. And the Russians know that he's not. And among those of us, there's a sneaking suspicion that we ourselves understand that this guy is absolutely naked. And this country is absolutely naked and will not be able to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat unless and until we stop playing with chess with ourselves and begin to interact in a more informed way with our enemies. But we aren't there yet. And we may not be there. I think it was Thomas Ricks, who used to work for the Washington Post, who wrote a book about US policy in Iraq called Fiasco. Well, this is a fiasco as well. This is what we're good at. We've become great at tearing things down, but not so good at rebuilding. And there are others in the wings who are prepared to rebuild. And these people may not have our best interests at heart.
And can you explain how Egypt relates to all of this?
Yeah, Egypt is sort of a sleeping giant here. Under its current president, President Sisi, Egypt's sort of regional role has atrophied. At one point in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we remember Anwar Sadat's historic visit to Israel, his peace treaty with Israel, that handshake on the White House lawn with President Carter. Egypt was at the center and a centerpiece of U.S. policy in the region and toward the Arab world in general. Now Egypt is sort of almost an afterthought. The main drivers of policy in the Arab world, it's not Egypt. You don't think about Egypt. You think about Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the Gulf generally. You don't think about Egypt, which is the most populous and historically has been at the center of pan-Arab politics since the 1940s. So Egypt's role is much smaller in our own view than it ever has been. And as a consequence, is on the receiving end of all of these changes in the region, rather than being a player that's creating the rules. And that's playing out, if so far informally, on the whole question of the American commitment to Egypt's security arsenal, which again, the details of which were established with the peace treaty between the U.S., Egypt, and Israel in the late 1970s, early 1980s. When you change certain pieces of that puzzle, you necessarily call into question all the pieces, one of which is, to what degree is the U.S. going to supply Egypt with military equipment? And that's an inescapable consequence of the calls in Congress today for rethinking Israel's defense relationship with the United States. And perhaps that part of that piece hasn't been as explicitly understood as it should be and as it might well be.
What's the biggest takeaway you hope my listeners get out of this conversation, whether they're just interested listeners or policymakers or wonks? What do you want them to get out of this?
Well, the first thing is that they should take a look at my Substack page whenever they
Indeed.
want. It's free. So that would be great for me. But I think it's important to look without blinders at what we're engaging in here as a community, as a political community, and to see that that policies that make us only feel good about ourselves, but aren't grounded in a real appreciation of what's happening on the ground, do us nationally a disservice. We have to confront the world as it is, and if we're naked, we've got to go back to the store and put some clothes on somewhere. And all too often, even those people who have our best interests at heart, and I'm including members of Congress in this, certainly on both sides of the aisle, but we deserve a more complete understanding of the profit and losses involved in our policy choices. And when it comes to Israel's nuclear capacity, we can't treat it simply as a political football to score points against our adversaries in Congress or on Capitol Hill. We have to treat these issues with the seriousness that they deserve, and if only to protect ourselves from the more successful efforts at policy formation that our adversaries may be practicing, and even our friends, if we include Israel and Europe in this. So it calls for constant engagement, not one-off gotcha politics here. And I think the proof of the pudding is whether or not this effort by members of Congress is one aspect of a sustained engagement, or as just a shot across the bow that we're not necessarily committed to understanding or promoting.
Can I add one more thing in here, Geoffrey, real quick?
Sure.
Because you made me think of it a moment ago. You were talking about how we don't necessarily have leadership that thinks about the facts on the ground. And I was reminded of that quote by Karl Rove back in I think the 2004, where he said, you know, people like you are in what we call the reality-based community. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying
Mhm.
that reality judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. Um, it's kind of interesting because I feel like we're living with the consequences of that mentality now. Am I off base?
Yeah, and he's absolutely right, except that he's wrong. He's right in the sense that empires create their own victories. They manufacture their own realities on the ground. But at some point, they stop being able to do that. And the dynamic uh, evolves not in their favor. So that's what we've seen. Arguably, we've seen it since Vietnam, is that an American inability to translate policy policy preferences into permanent positive changes on the ground that serve our interests. What we've been doing for quite some time is taking money out of the bank and not putting a lot back in. And at some point, that system comes up short. And I think we're seeing that. And if you read what the Russians are saying on a daily basis, if you read what the Chinese are saying, the Indians, Pakistanis, elsewhere in the world, that there are new realities being fashioned that don't owe their existence or their substance to simply an American fiat. And there are other boys at the table today who can exercise power in a way which wasn't the case when, as Karl Rove said, we were an empire and we could create reality to suit our interests. We've been trying that to do it, but we've been coming up short for quite some time.
We've become drunk on that kind of hubris in a way that Rove had there.
You froze on me there.
I said we've become drunk on the very same hubris that allowed Karl Rove to say that, and now it's not benefiting us.
Yeah, no, it hurts us because uh, if you're getting rained, what's the expression? If somebody's peeing on you and you think you're just getting rained on, you're absolutely wrong. It's not rain that's falling on us here. We're getting slaughtered.
I want to thank you again, Geoffrey Aronson, for coming on Parallax Views. Uh, can you just plug your Substack real quick?
Yeah, just look for me at Geoffrey Aronson. I think it's Geoffrey Aronson's Substack page.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.